Boom. And just like that, we're live. Dave Feldman, welcome to Seattle, buddy.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So you've been on the road quite a bit. I remember you sent out a tweet saying that you were going to go from Vegas to, I want to say, the Northeast somewhere, and then you bounced all around. And now you're back on the northwest side of the world.
So Denver, DC, Gold Coast, Australia, Houston, San Francisco just now.
Yeah.
And then I flew from San Francisco to come here because you're that awesome.
I love it. Grateful. Yeah. And your wife's coming in, so you guys are going to do some touring around.
She is. Yeah. That was kind of a deal we had where she just gets a break of a couple days, and so we're going to get a little like mini vacay here in town. And I mean, Seattle's amazing.
It is.
I'm looking forward to it.
That's awesome. So Dave, when I met you, you don't remember this, but I had to tell it on air for everyone here, guys. And just want to let you guys know, we are going to check into your comments towards the end. We're going to pick Dave's brain, talk about a lot of different things. But so going back to Low Carb San Diego 2016.
I do remember meeting you.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
And you were brand new to look like you were just really feeling it out for the first time. I think that was kind of your big dunking, right?
A little bit, yeah. From a standpoint, like I had been keto for a year, and I'd interviewed other people with Skype, and then from that point on, I started really interviewing a bunch of people, putting on this YouTube channel, and one of the people that I wanted to introduce myself was Dom D'Agostino.
Yeah.
And I remember you had your laptop, and you kept saying, "I'm an engineer," and pointing to these things, and he was shaking his head, and I'm like, what are they talking about? And you were sharing with him your initial data. So for folks that are new to your work, I mean, you've been self-experimenting. You've had over 120 blood tests, plus or minus?
Not that many, 105.
Close. And so at what point, like how many blood tests in did you start to notice this pattern?
2.
Wow.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the stories, I've of course stayed the story a lot, but I'm kind of reliving it to some degree because it's been 3 years ago this month. So I've really been sort of reminiscing a lot more lately, and especially in a kind of larger picture sort of fashion. But I got a very scary cholesterol test where, sure enough, I saw that my total cholesterol, which was what I was focusing on the most, was I want to say 329.
Wow.
And sort of as a kind of second opinion, I guess you could say, I was like, and I need to confirm this is real, decided to schedule another one that was going to be 2 weeks from then. And in that period of time, I learned everything I could about cholesterol. Granted, it was only 2 weeks. But I also kept seeing a pattern, which, is kind of how the story goes. So it was sort of a weird combination of being depressed while also weirdly interested in this lipid pattern because it looked like what I see in my work as a software developer. And that second test, my LDL and my total had jumped up substantially. My total jumped up to, I think it was 424 or 425.
That's a huge jump in 2 weeks.
It's a massive jump.
What did you make? What sort of dietary changes did you do? You tried to...
I was depressed, so my caloric intake dropped.
Yeah.
And I stayed keto, so it was still keto, but my total and saturated fat had also dropped.
Okay.
Now, as it was dropping that much, I did lose some weight. So I did anticipate, it might even bump up a little bit for my losing weight. But more than anything else, I kept thinking, well, one thing's for certain, though. It'll almost certainly go down given just how little fat I've been eating. And that's why I contend to this day, I may be the only person who is actually relieved to see his LDL cholesterol go up by 100. That was the second data point, second blood test. And that was the beginning of the inversion pattern.
Right. And so you attribute that to less energy in the form of carbohydrates coming in, so more free fatty acids from the adipocytes and VLDL moving around, or what is that kind of the basis of it, or?
I'm going to give you the elevator pitch.
Yeah.
For those people who are not familiar with this, I have an analogy I now like to use. So it's about boats. Your body, my body, we make boats that ship around stuff that's hydrophobic. It's literally the technical word. And that means stuff that doesn't want to swim. And if it doesn't want to swim in water and our blood is water-based, we have to make boats. So our body makes these boats. Well, fat is hydrophobic.
Yeah.
It doesn't want to swim. And the problem is that, like many people, I I came into the keto diet talking about ketones, learning about ketones, how the liver breaks fat into ketones, and thinking that I'm powered almost entirely by ketones. And this was new to start thinking about it this way, that no, actually, and you actually had Peter Defty on recently.
Yeah, he's a great
who brought
guy.
this up. Love Peter Defty. He, by the way, he mentioned he too in 2016, he had met me, and I want to give him kudos because I had 2 long conversations at Low Carb Vail. One was Ivor Cummins, one was Peter Defty. And Peter Defty, yes, we were immediately commiserating because he was like, I see this pattern a lot with athletes. Well, I was saying, I feel like this is an energy distribution network, as in it's a network where our body is constantly bringing in these fatty acids to give to our tissues. The question is, where is it coming in from? And if it's coming in from food we ate, then that kind of boat is called a chylomicron. It's a big, huge boat.
Right.
But that gets cleared right away. The other kind of boat that does come from your adipocytes, right? That's actually, or I should say, the cargo comes from your adipocytes, the fat, and ultimately gets packaged up into your liver in VLDLs. And those eventually remodel to LDLs.
Right.
And the cargo that's in there is not just those fatty acids that power us. The cargo in VLDLs are also cholesterol, which stays with it when it becomes LDL. And that's why you see higher LDL with many people who go and become powered by fat. So what happened was, because I was fasting a lot, or I should say at least that I was bringing down the total caloric load during those 2 weeks, less incoming fat means less chylomicrons.
Right.
Means more mobilization of those fatty acids from adipocytes going into the liver, means more VLDLs, means more remodeled LDLs, means more LDL cholesterol. That's
So more boats.
more boats.
Just delivering more stuff. Interesting.
yeah.
So 10 years ago, I don't know if I told you, but I sold advanced lipoprotein particle testing for a while.
I didn't know that.
So what I would see is when people, their numbers would go up because when they became more insulin sensitive or fasted or whatever, because the composition of the boat shifted.
Right.
So the amount of cholesterol within the boat became more predominant. Triglycerides were dumped. Where does that kind of fit in?
Well, triglycerides aren't dumped. That's a lot of the literature will talk about it this way, which
Yeah.
is why I find it entertaining now. Siobhan also researches for me a lot, and she has a lot of great work herself from Cholesterol Code. But we commiserate now whenever we see studies and they talk about how they're leaking out or how they're dumped or whatever. No, provide is a better word. Triglycerides are being provided to your tissues as a form of energy. So how they get removed is relevant. Your advanced testing that you're talking about definitely is a big deal, because what the remodeled LDL particle looks like kind of gives a clue as to what the boat's history is.
Okay.
Did it start out as a VLDL? Okay. Did it succeed at delivering its cargo of energy? Yeah. Is it otherwise not being used and therefore it's remaining in the vascular system? Yeah. And this gets to the most important question that is kind of really the core of my research. The first question's been answered, which is, if you go on a low-carb, high-fat diet, if you become powered by fat, is there a decent possibility that you're going to see your total and LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, go up? I think that's been answered.
Right.
Yes.
But should you be concerned about it is kind of the thing.
That's the bigger question.
Right.
That's the central question.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what I try to emphasize is my work in trying to establish this as an energy distribution system as part of what gave me the lens to see what that would look like. What would a lipid system that had a high LDL look like if there was in fact a healthy version of it? And right now I think the predominant answer in medicine is there isn't one. If you have a high LDL, you're going to be more likely to die. End of discussion.
Because it's atherogenic, it can be oxidized, the whole thing, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. And regardless of the different pathogenesis kinds of things that can be talked about, my question then becomes, all right, so can I find studies whereby a certain lipid pattern that seems to be predominant in those people who are low carb show that high LDL is not closely associated with high cardiovascular disease. And you may already know the answer to this. I have. I found not only 2 studies that show this and that number in the thousands, but I'm actively pursuing more from existing data sets that are out there, from MESA, from Women's Health Initiative, from Pure. I would love to.
Oh yeah.
I would love to run regressions on all of these, and in all of them, I would like to look at those people who have high HDL, low triglycerides, and then see if high LDL equates to high cardiovascular disease. And my hypothesis is that it doesn't, whether they're on a low-carb, high-fat diet or not, that actually that suggests a properly functioning lipid system.
So interesting, which I see why a lot of people grapple with this, because we're taught anything with an ApoB, is it ApoB 48 or ApoB 100 on the LDL?
ApoB 100.
ApoB 100, that's atherogenic. So the more that you have, the more at risk you are for developing the macrophage engulfed, sclerotic plaques and so forth, right?
Right.
But that's viewing it through the lens of like traditional cardiology. And so one thing Nina Teicholz, talks about is when we have like a sweeping change in a paradigm, it's usually someone from the outside that comes in with a different lens. And I think you were really that person to say, hey guys, I know you were all taught this way in medical school, nutritional school, whatever, but we're and through your engineering mind are able to look at cholesterol through a different lens and offering a new perspective. And I think a lot of people, including people you've been interviewed by, are still fixated on that atherogenicity of the lipoprotein. So yeah. So what are the cut points again? So you mentioned, so if you're low carb, high fat, metabolically flexible, probably, do you have to be athletic? I mean, if you have high HDL, low triglycerides, there's some people where, and we've used this term in functional medicine, like it's not earned. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you have a high HDL, but you don't really exercise. I mean,
no, there's plenty of people I know who are not athletic, who absolutely meet the criteria of having very high HDL, having very low triglycerides. But on top of that, there's mediation between them. So, for example, somebody brings me a lipid panel and they say, hey, what do you think about this? Is this concerning? And I always go through the same stock speech of, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional. Caveat, caveat, caveat. That said, let's say that their HDL cholesterol is 55, and let's say that their triglycerides are 95. I myself would consider that a pretty good panel. And I'm not even that sure how much I can care about LDL cholesterol given the studies, as I mentioned before. Almost every time you stratify those 3 together, and let's kind of cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Why is it that I want to put extra focus on triglycerides and HDL? Well, as it happens, of course, they tend to correlate with hyperinsulinemia. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. So oftentimes people who have a lot of persistent insulin in the body, and I don't like the term insulin resistant, but a lot of people would refer to it this way, insulin resistant, have something known as atherogenic dyslipidemia. And what that usually is low HDL, high triglycerides, and typically what you see is small, dense LDL particles. And I don't put as much stock into the small, dense LDL particles because I'm still thinking of them as boats. How much do they get depleted of their triglycerides matters to me as to whether it's done in a healthy way or not. But that's why I keep coming back to HDL and triglycerides being coupled with LDL is common in the existing data sets. So you can't find a lot of data sets for which they happen to have fasting insulin along with LDL. But there are plenty that actually have all 3 of those axes, HDL, triglycerides, and LDL. So in that regard, that's why I can say, even without knowing what this person's diet is, can I feel that they were fueled a lot by fat?
Right.
I feel like I can when I see that axis. And for that matter, that they probably don't have some other challenge event, some other disease state that would also involve the lipid system.
Like inflammation, cancer, even something along those lines.
There are other things that can bring up triglycerides as a response. And I'm going to plug Siobhan Huggins one more time because she's written a lot about this in Cholesterol Code. There are inflammatory and immune responses that result in the body upregulating LDL particles, in particular VLDL particles that are triglyceride rich, in order to quickly and rapidly tackle the illness.
Is a way to kind of finance the immune response through energy in the form of lipids?
It's really actually the physical boats.
Okay.
Something that a lot of people don't realize is that these lipoproteins, part of their role, arguably, is to bind to pathogens. It's also to provide a means of coverage for alpha tocopherol, which many know as a form of vitamin E. Mm-hmm. And I mean, these are like actual antioxidants. It's interesting because in the literature, they describe it as they're antioxidants for their own defense.
Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, really.
It doesn't when you think of the sheer quantity. These are measured in quintillions. A quintillion is 1,000,000 trillions. So you have in your body right now about half of all of the world's grains of sand along every beach and every desert around the world right now. That's the quantity of LDL particles
blood.
you have. Yeah, in everyone's blood. And think
crazy.
about that. You've got like, say, 6 molecules of alpha tocopherol, let's just say, on an average. You're talking 10 quintillion of those things actively a part of the antioxidant defense system, constantly donating their hydrogen atoms in order to make non-reactive products from not just reactive oxygen species from the things you're actually ingesting, but also things you naturally make just from exercise and many other factors. And this is why I know it's anecdotal, but I'm sure you've heard of this plenty of times before. There's surprisingly powerful levels of recovery that we see from people.
All the time.
And I think a lot of this can also come back to the reparative aspects that are associated with LDL particles. I actually did a recent experiment on this. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I don't think so.
It was a resistance training experiment. I actually ate the same food at the same times of day and took my lipids at the same time of day for about, I think it was around 20 days. And I wanted to be sure that I got about a level amount of lipids, and then introduced exactly 2 interventions. There were 2 high-intensity exercise interventions. The first one was a HIIT plus a vibration plate, and then 4 days later it was weightlifting plus the vibration plate. The first one wasn't as heavy as the second one. The second one was super heavy, and it almost looks like it faked the data. It's this perfect like curvature down on the first intervention, another curvature down another. And in other words, my LDL dropped by around 11%. On that first one by the bottom level. And then on the second one, it went down by 13%.
Wow.
You can see it dropping down. And my theory, my hypothesis, is that what you're observing is, I'm going to say a geeky term here.
Let's do it, yeah.
Is receptor-mediated endocytosis in peripheral muscle tissue. In other words, my muscle tissue for growth and repair is literally grabbing LDL particles, because LDL particles, they're made, their monolayer outside is made of phospholipids and free cholesterol.
Right.
And what are the cell membranes we all have made of?
Phospholipids, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bilayer of phospholipids and free cholesterol. Well, if you have a problem with your house, I punch a hole in your wall, you may have enough dry wood that's in your garage, but if Home Depot is driving past your house constantly and it's giving away free stuff, you might just go ahead and take that instead, right?
Totally. Wow, that is super fascinating. I'm just going to check on the feed, Dave, because I really would hate for anyone to have issues, and I think we might be having issues. But I have a lot of follow-up questions on that. So guys listening, and if the feed is okay, I apologize for this little hiatus, and I don't want to lose that train of thought about the other mechanisms of LDL, or other, we should say, roles that it plays in the body, above and beyond nutrient transport.
Yeah.
And that
if you want, while you're checking that, I could just mention this.
Let's do it.
What I'm really coming around to, and this is kind of really the hardest part to explain to a lot of people, is that we're talking about vehicles. Because they're vehicles, just like the vehicle you have, it can have multiple jobs.
Yeah.
If I tell you, hey, I used my car a lot last week. Can you believe that? I didn't tell you a lot, right? You could feel sad if you thought that I was using it to take my mom to the hospital. Or you could feel good for me because you thought I was going to a concert, right?
Yeah.
Every night. Okay, the problem is that doesn't tell us a lot. Well, the vehicle of a ApoB100 lipoprotein, the one that comes from the liver,
Yeah.
you could argue, and I certainly could make this case, that its first job, if it comes as VLDL, is to deliver triglycerides. That is absolutely its first job.
Yeah.
It's coming out, it's delivering triglycerides, and then it's clocking out and going into what I would argue is the support role. The very thing I was just telling you about as far as remaining resident, those that don't get absorbed by the liver have a residency time of like 2 to 4 days. Why would the body do that? Why would it leave it out there for 2 to 4 days? And I believe it's for the very roles I was telling you about binding to pathogens, about possibly playing a reparative role. So it'd be kind of like if your job in the morning was to deliver food to the homeless, and that took you about an hour. And then you clocked out, and then you patrolled, and you were like neighborhood watch. And you patrolled the neighborhood for like 2 to 4 days, and before finally clocking out, heading back, and then your next job is to do the same thing again. But the delivering of the energy, that only takes you an hour.
Right.
That's the same
It's
thing.
like a minor role. So what it sounds like.
It's minor in its time spent.
Yeah.
I would argue it's actually its major role. It's really its full-time job. It's just that it's not full-time.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. When a VLDL leaves the liver, that's its primary payload.
Deliver energy to the periphery.
It's triglycerides. It's triglyceride full, and it will almost certainly drop it off if you have a healthy metabolism.
Right.
Almost certainly, right?
Insulin sensitive.
Yeah.
Would you say?
If you're insulin sensitive. Now, if you're not, then we have to talk about something else, which is which is the reason why if you see high triglycerides in somebody's body, it's a powerful leading indicator of a problem, because it's not dropping it off. It's failing at its first job.
Yeah.
Why is it failing at its first job? Well, oftentimes you're past your personal fat threshold.
Right.
Where are you going to park that energy?
Yeah.
Where are you going to park those triglycerides that you're supposed
Deliver
to be
the
powered
pancreas,
by?
the wherever, right? Ectopic.
Exactly. Exactly. Look, ectopic fat, it seems from a distance like, why would we ever put fat into other organs that were not designed to maintain fat, like our adipose tissue? And there's a pretty obvious reason. It's because there is a worse place to park that energy, and that's in the bloodstream.
Right.
You don't want to park it on the freeway, the most critical freeway by which you need to get everything everywhere, including oxygen, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like almost like a last resort in a sense. Do you know that light, can you turn up, it says 26, there's a little wheel, hit it to 32. Sorry guys, we're just cranking the light. Use your thumb. Keep going. Yep. Go to 32. It just looked a little bright. That's probably good. Super interesting. Let's park that thought a little bit before we go on a little bit, before we go on too far about this. And this is super fascinating. And guys, if you enjoy this content, just hit that like button. And I do want to thank our show sponsor, perfectketo.com. Without their support, this would not be made available. So as a listener of High Intensity Health Radio, you can save 20% off. Just enter in the promo code HIH20 at checkout. And they have a great new low-carb, high-fat whole food bar. Did you try that in San Diego or San Francisco? Because I think they were there.
In San Francisco, I tried a lot of bars there. I don't remember.
I don't know if they had samples.
I'll have to see the logo.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So going back to if you want to call it the antimicrobial or the immunological roles of lipoproteins, that's I've been following that story since like 2009 when it started to emerge, and I think you and maybe Rhonda Patrick are the only two people that I've heard talk about it online. So I want to commend you for that. But a lot of people are unaware of that.
Yeah.
And it adds into this new, like, for example, so if your LDL is really high, and we've seen that there's some research with emerging about metabolic endotoxemia, meaning that if you have intestinal permeability and you have gram-negative bacterial antigens coming in, it could be a compensatory mechanism of the cholesterol to neutralize those. And then you were saying too, the alpha tocopherol, vitamin E on the cell surface,
particularly for the antioxidant defense, right?
Correct. As a way, so we know that our immune system, one way that it kills pathogens is through reactive oxygen and reactive nitrogen species, like free radicals. Puke, these immune cells, monocytes, macrophages puke out free radicals to kill pathogens. So it's very convenient then to have this vitamin E floating around.
It is. Well, and it's not just that. I mean, I'm sure if you've looked into free radicals, you understand that they are practically like the antimatter of our bloodstream. If it's running loose, I mean, that unpaired electron, that can ultimately initiate a chain oxidation. Okay, where would you like that to land? Well, you wouldn't like that to land on a cell if you could help it. To what degree you could help to control that, you want to, of course, right? Well, that's why in many respects, I can think of that second job, clocking out as VLDLs, moving into LDLs, in many ways, is a bit of an oversimplification, but not by a lot. They're kind of like the bumper on your car. You'd like it to not get damaged, but you'd prefer it get damaged over your engine or even you getting damaged.
Right.
And so to what degree that there seems to be this sort of hell-bent nature by which our body is like, no, I want to be sure that these are not only available, but as you just mentioned, that they may get upregulated in the course of an illness. That's why they have these experiments where, for example, they would inject lipopolysaccharides or TNF-alpha, other things that would actually signal it, like cytokines. The liver goes, oh, there's a problem. Bring up the LDLs, right? Get those ApoB100s rolling out because they need to be there for a response. We need to be able to respond to it. And this is a very relevant part to the story because they found people who have familial hypercholesterolemia to have the same or even a better survival rate going back like hundreds of years ago. And this is the assumption. The assumption is, okay, that may have been more of an advantage before infection was better handled through modern medicine, right? But if that's the case, then you would expect all-cause mortality to always be lower if you had FH, even if you had heterozygous FH, which is not as concerning as homozygous FH.
Okay.
And I've got to say, I'm having a tough time right now because there's no existing studies for which there is a true placebo control arm of somebody who has heterozygous FH. But the times in which they go and check into like registries and so forth, you would expect that they would all have a lower all-cause mortality, not just cardiovascular disease. But if cardiovascular disease on top of everything else was problematic, then they shouldn't get enough benefit from the other side of the ledger of things like not dying of infection. But
data doesn't pan out.
Yeah, one of the best studies is this pedigree study where they went back, I want to say like 150 years or something like that. And it was really impressive, and they found that their all-cause mortality was roughly the same depending on what location they were at with other cohorts in the same area. And I've also read a number of studies where they'll check into a registry. They'll find that, sure enough, there was a more favorable survivability than they thought that there would be. And then they attribute it to maybe their own awareness of it made them have better habits. But that's without actual data to support that that's exactly what happened, right? So again, I can't emphasize enough. I can supply a lot of information that has led me to think differently about risk. And at the same time say, look, I'm not decided in that the lipid hypothesis is false. I could be wrong about that. I want to be a good scientist. And I want to be able to say, I don't know for sure. That said, I do wish there wasn't as much pushback on trying to get this better understanding. If the energy model is right, and if in fact that's why we should focus on seeing these better lipid markers on existing data sets, let's look at it. What's the harm?
At least have an open mind to it.
Right.
Talk about it. I wonder then if people that have a history of low cholesterol, if they're more susceptible to immune issues or infection. Because we do hear sometimes, I think individuals over the age of 65, a high LDL cholesterol, high total cholesterol is linked with better longevity, like reduced mortality incidence. And maybe that is because as we age, our immune system becomes more and more compromised and so forth. And then having those particles around, that's super fascinating stuff. So I definitely... That's a huge takeaway. We're going to talk about many more aspects of this, but everyone listening right now just hit that's a gem, huge gem about the additional aspects of this. And so with regards to HDL, so we know that's involved in reverse cholesterol, kind of pulling cholesterol and energy. How does that fit into this energy model or energy paradigm of cholesterol?
Well, the very short version is that you're going to see a lot more HDL cholesterol, especially the more you're powered by fat, because there tends to be a higher level of it when you've got more VLDL turnaround. In other words, if you are secreting higher VLDLs, they're dropping off lots of triglycerides through mechanisms associated with some of the more technical things like cholesterol ester transfer protein and so forth. You've got a lot that gets more involved to the degree with which it's going to bring up more HDL. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where it gets interesting. HDL is actually not a very well understood species. There's another paper that Siobhan put in front of me that shows that they're just barely scratching the surface on all of the many aspects it's involved with. But this also includes an immune response. It has actually a number of different complex things it can do in an immune response that makes it also make sense to have more HDL. And I really want to drive home just this kind of larger term I want everyone to become familiar with moving forward whenever they talk about cholesterol, period. And it's all-cause mortality. This came up again on Twitter today, by the way. I feel like this shouldn't even have to get talked about, but it does, because people who like to talk about LDL cholesterol needing to be lower and it potentially bringing down cardiovascular disease, I can agree that I've seen lots of things for which it is a loose association. The problem that I have is once you bring in all-cause mortality, it ends up having hardly any effect at all, especially on primary prevention. And there's a lot of studies behind that. Now, that may not make sense were it not for the thing we just now talked about, right? Which is, hey, wait a sec. If you reduce cardiovascular disease, shouldn't the balance be that you've reduced your chance of dying, period?
Right.
But what if you do have a benefit against infection, against even cancer, right? Obviously, if you have more antioxidant defense, you're going to prevent, say, DNA from getting damaged, things along those lines. Well, that's obviously relevant. So why don't we go ahead and power every study to include all-cause mortality? Because at the end of the day, we just want to know whether we're going to die sooner, not whether we die sooner of one particular thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so what I heard you say there tacitly is maybe the studies are just focusing just on cardiovascular mortality.
Yes.
Too narrow-mindedly. And so the reader is then left with the conclusion that I'm just going to die earlier, even though it's just talking about cardiovascular disease and mortality.
And I got to call a duck a duck.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something they don't mind.
Because it sells more things.
Again, I try not to get onto statins in particular, but I do sort of feel like there's nobody. Let me put it this way. I don't feel like any doctor who asks somebody to go on a statin says, this will reduce your chance of having a non-fatal myocardial infarction. But it won't reduce your chance of dying at all if it's primary prevention, right? Or for that matter, that we haven't powered any study in a statin that tracks other events that are not cardiovascular related, such as severe sicknesses that can also, for example, if you get cancer and survive it, how is that almost certainly going to be better than if you have, an MI and you survive it?
Right.
Well, the only way you can really know is if you power a study to find that out. And they don't do that.
Do you think we have enough data to then relook at the data that way and run the stats, or no?
No. And for that matter, again, trying to avoid the statin discussion, but the statin data, for the most part, is either controlled by the trialists that have it or the CTT, which actually is the one legal entity that has the bulk of many of this cholesterol data. And it only puts out 100% positive data, effectively, about lowering LDL. And
Interesting.
it's just the world we're in. This isn't even to say that I'm certain that they're wrong. But do I wish that there were more transparency? Do I wish other teams could, that there was more capability of other people to analyze the data? I do, absolutely. And that's been kind of a struggle for me personally, is that in coming into this, I come from the world of technology.
Yeah.
We're used to being awash in free data. We're used to companies that are trying to espouse data, trying to get it into our hands so that we can prove it for ourselves. And it's exactly the opposite here. Like I want to run these regressions, for example, but I can't just say, hey, where can I get the archive of this so that I can, check it? I know it's in a flat file somewhere where I could just
get the raw data.
Yeah, with Excel. Like I should be able to do this. I don't even need R or one of these more advanced things. I just want to look, right? And you can't do that. What they would argue is they would say, well, that would violate patient privacy. And I'd be like, well, just give me anonymized. Anonymize the data. We're just talking lipid panels.
Yeah.
You think I'm going to figure out it's, John
Sally Smith and
exactly in Ohio because it's this profile.
Yeah.
And it's not, again, the challenge I have, and I think this is sort of where a little more of my soul searchings come in recently, is I really have what I'd like to think is a genuine, earnest motivation to really get to the answer to this question.
Right.
I almost put it this way. I say, help me. I say this to people who are opponents to my work. Help me prove me wrong. Right? Like, you probably have more access. I will say this to them. You probably have more access than I do. You probably have more weight. You have the data scientists and so forth. Help me find out that this energy model is wrong, because it should be easier to falsify it.
Yeah.
But whether I meant to go this route or not, I keep designing these experiments to further elucidate the energy aspect of it, and they seem to keep providing more evidence to show it. And God bless it, Mike. It's, for heaven's sake, I just did a white bread and processed meat experiment, and it wrecked me. It sucked, but it further proved the energy model, right?
Because it made your LDL healthier in terms of standard cut points.
Yeah, it did. And I predicted it in advance of the experiment happening. I actually did a YouTube video so that I could timestamp it, predicting that I would actually break my own record and how far down my LDL would go, which at that point the record was 103 milligrams per deciliter. And I smashed through that in 7 days. Yeah.
You went from, you went over, it was like 110, the delta? The drop?
No. The drop was the fastest ever. So I started at, I want to say, 296. It was at the very beginning of the experiment. And at the peak where I was switching over to the full amount of white bread and processed meat, I was at 296. And 7 days later, I dropped it to 82.
Oh my gosh.
So I dropped it, I want to say 213, something like that. Met with my prediction. Why? Because I was switching from a fat-based diet, therefore lots of boats providing energy that ultimately could remodel to LDL, to a carb-based diet, which of course is primarily glucose. And I believe also to some degree filling up my glycogen stores meant that there was going to be a lot less VLDL provided on the fly. That said, what happened to the two markers I care about, HDL and triglycerides? HDL went way down.
Triglycerides shot up.
Triglycerides were the highest I think I've ever recorded. I think it was like 240 something, 250 something. Yeah.
Fasting?
No, 14 hours fasted.
Oof, man. But how do you feel about this? Because you're really, again, you have enough data and you're actively trying to have people disprove. I mean, that's a lot of people just want to confirm what they know, that whole confirmation bias, right?
Right.
But historically in medicine, you were on the low carb cruise when Kim Berry talked about the Austrian physician Csikszentmihalyi, or the gentleman who had this preposterous idea that surgeons should wash their hands before delivering babies and so forth, right? But he was ostracized, and it wasn't until long after his death that finally that. So anyway, what I'm trying to establish
is he died in an insane asylum,
right?
Of all things, yeah.
So you come from an era where there's a lot of from a career or what do you call it? Occupation, industry where there's a lot of horizontal integration,
right?
And medicine is very much like, we've been doing it this way. We were taught this. This is what my mentor taught me, and this is the status quo. So it could be 10, 20 years before these ideas become mainstream. So have you grappled with that? Like that? How do you?
Yeah,
it's gotta be frustrating.
It's a frustrating, and again, I think a lot of this has come around to this being 3 years ago to the month. I mean, what had changed? Like 3 years ago to the month, I was panicked. Like I was scared. Like did I do so? I mean, for me, it was like a cancer diagnosis.
Right.
I mean, of course, I thought, well, maybe I can just put the toothpaste back in the tube get off of low carb, which, by the way, would have, knowing what I know now, probably would have worked to bring my LDL down. But so my HDL was regularly around 40 before I went keto. Now it's almost always in the 60s when I'm keto and not when I'm on one of these experiments. What a difference 3 years have made, because now I'm in this different place. Here's the catch. Per what you were just talking about, I naively thought, just a few months in, very naively, I was like, wow, this data needs to get to the people who study this. This needs to get to lipidologists. Lipidologists are like, in my imagination, I thought I was going to be like showing my papers, showing my computer. They were going to snatch it and then run with it. And there would be, experiments doing more on the inversion pattern and how, in fact, this may actually be a healthy place for keto people if it turns out that it doesn't, as I'm saying with the retrospective data, if that doesn't show as well. And I was just wrong. And what it comes down to is what you were just alluding to, which is I like to call it scientific tribalism now. And to be sure, we have to be self-assessing. We are part of the same thing.
Yeah, totally.
We are naturally tribal, humans. And I mean, sports teams prove it over and over again to us, right? Just what town you're in has a lot to do with what you're going to see with the paraphernalia everybody's wearing around you. Their moods are going to change, even if they're not that much into that sport, by how much they act, that sports team makes it to the championship, et cetera, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, this does apply across even the place where we would assume there would be boundaries. It applies to science. And that's been a tough lesson for me to learn, because I think I grew up romanticizing science, especially in medicine. I kind of blame Hollywood to some extent, because you ever watch a show, you watch ER or whatever, and House, MD, and they are so adamant. They seem to be so incredibly open-minded, but yet of all of the knowledge.
Yeah.
And the more that you get to know doctors, the more you find out they're like us. They have their pet theories, they have their favorite medicines, they have their favorite tools, and a lot
favorite drug reps, device reps.
Sure.
Yeah.
And favorites.
Yeah.
Right. And they're going to have a worldview, and we shouldn't actually hold that too much against them, truly. But we should recognize why that is an obstacle to work around, right? Why it's going to be a process to make a true paradigm shift. So to your earlier point, what does it take for a paradigm shift? Sure, not only does it come with ideas from the outside, but it comes with time. I certainly that if this really is I certainly hope if this energy model proves, once we have an ability to measure things like autophagy, much more effectively. I immortalize this on record. I suspect that they're enjoying a higher level of autophagy because their area under the curve for total insulin, I mean, they're practically in a blended fasted state all the time. And that's why, by the way, I think they have a tough time doing multi-day fasting because their adipocytes are just constantly rotating. And I mentioned this before.
The flux and the turnover is much higher.
Super high, right? But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think your adipocytes really, really, really want to be used in the fashion that they are awesome at, and that's what they're good at, is staging and delivering triglycerides. So anyway, I think there actually may be a case to be made, in theory, that lean mass hyperresponders may turn out to be a superior metabolic profile.
I think, Dave, we might have to repeat that because...
Oh, we had a drop off in the stream?
We had a drop off, and I've been totally listening, and iTunes will get that. I know. It's fine, because I got it. Just check that one. How much time do we got on that one? Come on. We're good. So we are, okay. Guys, I'm so sorry. We're live here, and I'm sitting there, and it's saying, Mike, why would I want to stop this? It's not, I think there is a delay here, so let's just quickly... Okay, so we are good.
No worries.
Whew. Oh, man, guys, I'm so sorry. So we just had an issue where the stream got cut off. And Dave, you were talking about something absolutely amazing. And just in case part of that got cut off, the question that I asked you was, how can all of you listening or watching right now help Dave or help the model to test whether or not this energy hypothesis of cholesterol is at the right vernacular?
Yeah. I mean, I call it the lipid energy model.
So what can we do for that? How can we help there? And you were talking about how the lean mass hyperresponders could be the saviors, and you went on to this awesome, explanation. And I'm fearful that you didn't hear that. And just for the sake of redundancy, you probably need to hear it again. Why, and under what circumstances do you believe that the lean mass hyperresponders are going to help us confirm whether or not this theory is true?
Well, effectively, so again, the profile is they tend to have LDL above 200, and I've seen them in the 300s, 400s, and higher. They tend to have HDL above 80. I've seen them often in the hundreds, above 100. I see triglycerides of 70 or lower, and I've seen triglycerides in the 30s or 40s and 50s. So it tends to be those cut points, and they tend to often say it's the best they've ever felt. Like it's probably a good 95% will come in saying, this is just amazing. I don't want to stop doing this. Now, granted, that's a self-selected group. But that said, I've really not seen, I'm really actually struggling because I want to be as intellectually honest as I can. I can't think of one person who I can think of who got that phenotype and said, I've been feeling miserable, and now I figured out why. It's because I'm this. Now I've added back in more carbs or something, gotten away from that phenotype, and now I feel amazing. Mm-hmm. I'm no longer lean mass hyperresponder. It's usually the exact opposite, in that a lot of people are like, I really want to keep this going. This is amazing. I've never felt better. This is fantastic, but I'm freaking out. My doctor's freaking out. These LDL numbers are, my doctor says it's the highest it's ever been.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I give the usual caveats. I can't say that I know for sure. However, I keep coming back to the same thing, which is if this is the lipid energy model, it actually makes sense. And let me give you a quick analogy to kind of really drive it home. This seems to be one a lot of people get. Imagine we're near the water, right? Mm-hmm. We're in Seattle. And imagine we're on a harbor, and you're seeing a lot of boats that are going in and out of the harbor. They start with cargo, they end up going out, and they come back empty, right? And I'm out there with you, and I go, that's way too many boats. It's like 100 boats. Mm-hmm. You go, hold on, Dave, hold on. Let's just watch. Sure enough, we see that the ones that are going out come back without any cargo. You go, I think, Dave, wherever they're going, the demand is at least that much that they're taking that cargo. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fine. So we come back, a year later. It's 500 boats. I go, now that's definitely too much, Mike. Yeah. That's crazy. And you go, well, hold on. And we watch the rotation. They're coming back without cargo. You go, Dave, I don't know where they're going. I know this, though. They seem to be successful at delivering the cargo unless you think they're just dumping them off the boats. Mm-hmm. Okay. If I'm right and that there's more VLDLs constantly delivering their cargo successfully, then if your triglycerides are really low, whatever your LDL is, mm-hmm. whatever your LDL particle count is, it was probably needed to be at that level to meet the demand.
Right.
That's the energy model in a nutshell. And so when lean mass hyperresponders come back with very high levels of LDL, I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the ones who have the highest levels of LDL tend to be very lean, not a lot of adipose tissue, mm-hmm. and they tend to be very active. Like there's an ultramarathoner that I work with, really high levels of LDL.
Mm. Like what? How high? 300-400 range, or
no. His LDL is closer to, like, I want to say 400 and I want to say 470, 480, something along those lines.
Most primary care or internal medicine doctors would freak out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and for what it's worth, I always find however high their LDL is, I multiply the number of caveats I give them, mm-hmm. right?
Right.
But he insisted this was the absolute best he's ever performed. And actually, he's since turned around numbers that this is the case. I'm not sure how much I can say because he wants me to keep his identity secret because he feels like it's an advantage.
Yeah.
But he has been able to do these ultramarathons, and he contends, and I think he's right, that the more you engage your GI tract throughout the race, the more you ultimately start messing with your back end performance.
So you intentionally induce GI stress?
No.
Oh.
That
So
if he can keep from having any goos, if he can keep from eating anything, then he'll try to hold it off as long, right? Because he thinks he's pretty confident that on the back end he starts to like lose time and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so for being keto, he can go for much longer distance. He does eventually have to have something. And again, I'm not going to say anything on his secrets, but he has a longer stretch in the front, and he thinks he's eventually going to be able to improve it on the back. And he has absolutely no problem with his lipid profile at all, like zero. He says this. I think the energy model makes sense. And honestly, I don't care what caveats you give me anymore, Dave. This is what I've chosen to do.
Yeah.
And I just need to know, what you do consider concerning and so forth to let me know, right?
Like carotid IMT and imaging, that would be the next
his
phase.
CIMT is amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
It's younger than his actual ages.
Yeah.
So
that's so amazing. So that would be the only group, and not the only group, but something that you were talking about before the stream got cut off. And I'm really sorry for that, guys. I know it's Sunday here, and you're riveted listening to this amazing content. And you were talking about autophagy-driven.
Yes.
The aspect that lean mass hyperresponders, lean individuals, high LDL. Part of that could be the flux, the turnover,
right,
of the adipocytes, and just autophagy-driven cellular renewal.
Yeah. I mean, look. Do you get a lot of autophagy when you're hyperinsulinemic? No, we already know that.
Yeah.
Like that's already known, right? So obviously part of how you can accomplish having more autophagy, presumably, is maintaining as low of insulin as you reasonably can,
right?
Especially area under the curve. Well, this is such a commonality. I'll get lean mass hyperresponders and they'll turn around like, fasting insulin of 2 or 3 milli-IU, super, super low levels.
Right.
I suspect, and again, theory, hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, I suspect that they have enormous capability for autophagy. And I think it's no surprise at all, getting back to recovery time, why the recovery is just amazing. They can recover so fast. So, yeah.
And why they can't fast for prolonged periods of time.
Exactly. Because in a sense, they already are from their body's perspective.
Right.
And to be sure, I'm not saying that they can't, they have difficulty doing it. So I think a lean mass hyperresponder, for example, could, do a multi-day fast of like 7 days. But I can know from when I was leaner, going in early from I jokingly called it the fasting disaster. I plotted 3.5 days for which I'd be doing my fast. I made it 2 days. And I had to cancel the last day because I could hardly stand it.
Because you couldn't sleep, or you were really hungry, or low?
No, because it just felt awful.
Yeah.
It was almost as if, and it wasn't even like gut pain or anything along those lines. It was like there was I jokingly call it this way, it was like a red line that my body had down here to my brain up here saying, stop this.
Yeah.
This isn't
it's
any
just
good.
an intuitive thing,
Right.
kind of. Yeah.
Now, here's what's funny. The upside of the experiments that I've done that have gained me weight, so there's 3 experiments I've done this year that have gained me weight to where I'm still actually, I want to say around 11 pounds heavier than I was when I started all of these. I feel like I could do a 3-day fast now, and I might try it.
Yeah.
I don't like fasting, period, anyway.
Yeah.
But I think I could pull it off this time, and I almost want to do it just to see if I get that same scary feeling that I'd had from before.
Yeah. I found that too when I'm really lean. Fasting is challenging. Like right now, I'm a little bit heavier. But I try to pair fasting with like travel, because it makes sense because food's more expensive, it's inconvenient.
Hard to get exactly what you want.
Yeah, right. And generally, when I'm traveling, it's for work. I want to be mentally clear as I can be, and sometimes fasting helps with that a little bit.
Right.
Gosh, that's really interesting. That aspect of exercise-mediated autophagy is not really talked about a lot. Like we talk about in the keto space or the low carb space, you have to fast to trigger this cellular renewal process that's linked with longevity.
Yeah.
But there's a ton of research showing that the adaptations associated with exercise are autophagy mediated. Like you talked about your HIIT training and your weight training sessions, and you did blood work. Like after the fact, your body's repairing via autophagy, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that because there's a lot of research emerging about that, and I think it's fascinating. Deanna, how are we doing on that camera? How many more minutes? What does it say on the top left? 15. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we have time for some final questions, and I do want to get to some of your questions here, friends. So I think we talked about it, but what I was taught, particularly when I was selling lipoprotein particle testing, was the atherogenicity of remnant lipoprotein was on the hierarchy of the VLDL, remnant lipoprotein, LDL, of all the different lipoprotein particles, remnants were very atherogenic.
Absolutely. Well, okay, let me break this down a little bit.
Yeah.
So we talked about VLDLs ultimately remodeling to LDLs, right? The vast majority of remnants that could be detected are in fact VLDLs. So you can, in fact, I think the Wikipedia version of remnant cholesterol is if you took total cholesterol and you subtracted HDL and LDL cholesterol. What's left over is assumed to be what's in your VLDLs, right? Now, some number of those will be IDLs, possibly some number of those could be chylomicron remnants, but those are both generally as much less likely. It's mainly going to be VLDLs, which gets us back to the point I was talking about before. My theory is that actually it's not that VLDLs are very atherogenic, because I feel like that's just moving the target to a new place to be like, oh, this has a high association. That's the cause. I think it could be the other way around, in that, no, actually you're in a metabolic situation, such as being past your personal fat threshold, such as being hyperinsulinemic, where your body is having problems processing its existing lipid energy metabolism, and that will get associated with higher levels of, for example, cardiovascular disease. Because what do we see in a hyperinsulinemic state? We see this atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is associated with high triglycerides, which gets associated with high VLDL, which gets associated with high remnant cholesterol, which gets associated with high insulin, right? It's all of these things. This is why, like, lean mass hyperresponders, you take all of those out. Now you just have high LDL, but it's not for the reason of having high VLDL initiation.
Right.
It's actually having high turnover of VLDL. It's the opposite, and being powered by fat. So yeah, remnants being atherogenic, I believe that remnant cholesterol and remnant lipoproteins will be highly associated with an atherogenic circumstance. And certainly one you'd want to tackle, I think.
Yes. You know, that's such a great, it's a very simple yet profound way to review the whole situation. Because you're right, because these things are just associations. And then what you see is sometimes in a tissue culture model or in an animal model, and then they, kill the animal, sacrifice the animal, look at the atherosclerosis and whatnot, and say, see, this is what caused it. But it's also like the milieu, the environment. It's hard to separate some of that stuff out.
It is.
So, God, what a great, that's another major, there's many major take-homes. That's another huge one to really think about. So as long as, just to break this down, right, for people listening, if they're like new to keto, we've talked a lot of cool physiologic aspects and use big words, but as long as your HDL is reasonably high, triglycerides are low, one should not necessarily be too concerned about the potential atherogenicity or cardiovascular disease aspects of LDL cholesterol. Is that?
My current opinion is that's where it stands.
Okay.
And again, my opinion's subject to change with the data. The existing data as I see that has triglyceride HDL axis, that blows away LDL. It's not even a close call. And the existing data that I have that shows fixed levels of high HDL and fixed levels of low triglycerides being low levels of cardiovascular disease, likewise, is universal. I've yet to find one study for which LDL is shown to have a higher cardiovascular risk factor when HDL is high and triglycerides are low. And that's super important to understand if you're going low carb, because you're often going to see your HDL go up and your triglycerides go down.
Are you still going to pay someone $1,000 if they find you that study?
Oh,
maybe.
I actually originally had out as like $300 if anybody could give me a link, because there was a possibility I might get multiple links. I've not gotten a single link.
Wow.
But I might just raise it to $1,000. If that
I
would get me the link
out there floating around.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you all want to make some money, spend a lot of time in Google Scholar or PubMed and try to find us a study that shows that with high HDL, low triglycerides,
and high LDL.
high LDL,
That you have a high, you only need an above average, by the way, I relaxed it a lot. You only need an above average cardiovascular disease risk outcome. The only thing is it can't be a drug or gene study. Basically, it needs to be normal people. You can't grab a population that you stratified to a particular genetic abnormality or a lipid system that you like altered with like a CETP inhibitor or something like that, and that's how you got the markers you wanted.
Yeah.
That's one of my frustrations is I feel like there's way too much research that's being focused on not normal people.
And you have to look through the materials and methods to find that. I mean, sometimes in the abstract or the conclusion, they don't tell you that people are on drugs sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is, and then when you read the Wall Street Journal report or New York Times or whatever, they don't tell you that either, which is super interesting. Gosh, there's a couple aspects about this that I wanted to talk about with regards to fasting and non-fasting. Back in, I believe it was 2011, 2010, there was this consensus paper that came out that suggested that perhaps we might want to start clinicians should at least be familiar with the fasted, and then also if there is a hint at dyslipidemia or metabolic syndrome, that clinicians should use or implement a fat-loaded lipid test to see how the body processes these energy molecules in real time. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've been experimenting with that a little bit lately. There's not a whole lot of studies that are coming out about that, but I think you do recommend a lot of fasted lipid panels. And
for sure. So first of all, this is something I'm very vocal about. Yeah. Right now, they've changed the guidelines to my dismay, to where they tell people you don't need to fast for your cholesterol test. I'm so vehemently against that, especially if you're low carb. And here's why: if I have a fatty meal, I am I'm advisedly using the word literally taking the triglycerides from that. They will be pulled apart, repackaged back into chylomicrons. They will end up in my bloodstream. And at the point that you pull my cholesterol, you're going to have higher levels of triglycerides. Yeah. This isn't speculation. We've had people coming to cholesterolcode.com. We've had people coming to the Facebook group all the time. They'll be like, what the heck? My triglycerides exploded to 200, 300, whatever. And we go, was it fasted? Yeah. And oftentimes they'll be like, oh no, but I was told it didn't need to be fasted. And I only had a bulletproof coffee. Oh, okay,
That's
maybe.
That's exactly what I did, by the way.
Oh yeah, you had a bulletproof coffee?
Were your went from higher? 60 to 220.
Yeah.
And I was like, the cut points on triglycerides and non-fasted are 180, so I was a little bit nervous.
Right.
But then I looked at it, with your influence of this aspect that it's energy. And I just said, look, if I'm going to have that much energy, I need to be utilizing it, like going to the gym or working out. Like if I'm just sitting here, do I need that much energy in my blood if I'm just typing on a computer screen? So that's the way I kind of reframed it. But what would you?
No, you shouldn't have high triglycerides in your blood in a fasted test.
Right.
So I would want to see that.
Yeah.
And if you did, I would say, well, actually, Mike, it looks like you're not utilizing your existing fat stores, because I would expect it to be spinning a lot. If you get your test hours after you had just had fat, you consumed it, then I'm not expectant that it's going to be all pulled out of your bloodstream.
Right.
Particularly if you're operating on very low levels of insulin. But that's okay. I don't think that that's a problem at all. Right? In fact, I think that because a lot of the remnant cholesterol studies that they're doing right now are on non-fasted tests. And I'm actually against that because and again, this is theoretical, but I speculate that people on a low-carb diet who have lower basal insulin as well as lower bolus insulin, a lot of times in their response, are going to have longer residence time of fat in the chylomicrons and the VLDLs, relatively speaking. But in a fasted test, it should be like super low because it's their primary energy source.
Yeah.
Again, this is why I press for especially get a fasted test, especially if you're low carber, because it's really going to impact your lipid numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was really surprised at that delta, and that shift and so forth, just from like a bulletproof coffee, beforehand. Super interesting. So, do you think it's beneficial to look at that in context, knowing that, like, to see how people do handle? I mean, not to make any sweeping decisions whether or not they should be low carb or not, but maybe just to kind of see or
I myself have a tough time with that because I feel like in order to really know the context, we need to kind of do our own study on specifically low carbers and preferably ones who already have a low fasting insulin.
Right.
Until we do that, and then we could say, okay, now with these same people, we're going to do postprandial tests and now determine what their longer residence time is, if I'm right on my theory. Then we can actually know how much this is relevant to the larger question, right? But there's also another factor. We're not really talking about it as much, but they're beyond just having high trigs from, say, having bulletproof coffee. We know, for example, coffee itself.
Yeah.
For some people, there's a coffee sensitivity where they may have high triglycerides.
Right.
And that's
As
why
an immune response potentially.
It could be the caffeine. It could be because caffeine can also activate more lipo. We don't know yet. This is still relatively new. But that's why, like, a lot of times if people bring us their panels and we kind of see these different patterns, we can kind of get an idea based on what the pattern looks like. So, for example, in the one I just talking about with coffee, typically the big giveaway is your HDL is high. Usually you don't have high HDL and high triglycerides.
Right.
Usually your HDL is low when you have high triglycerides if it's atherogenic dyslipidemia, for example. But here's another example. Let's say your triglycerides are low, but your HDL is low, even though you're low carb. Then we like to look into it. There's really a few possible reasons for that, but probably the most predominant one is a genetic influence. If that's the case, usually that shows up in prior lipid panels. So, for example, if you had gotten ones before keto and your HDL was lower then, like let's say your HDL was,
35 or whatever.
35, but now it's like 43, then it's not as surprising. Not that we like to pick on HDL too much because you want to rule out that there's not a real problem.
Yeah.
An acute drop in HDL can be a problem for reasons we won't take time to go into now, but we like to look at these lipid panels. It's just in particular we like those two because they can say a lot.
Yeah. Interesting. Have you ever seen an HDL drop on keto? Like with all the... Okay.
Yeah, and it turned out to be a big problem.
A familial... Oh, really? There was pre-existing conditions that people didn't know about, or?
Yeah, so I want to mention this, but I want to mention it with an extra emphasis that this is super crazy rare. It very rarely happens because the moment I mention this, some people are going to go nuts over it. I don't want to do that. Yeah. In a couple cases, just 2 out of many,
right?
There was a very strange, bizarre, acute drop in HDL, and there was no good explanation for it. And in 2 cases, it did turn out to actually be cancer. And I had actually read something about that really early on in my research as to why sometimes people see really low HDL in seemingly a response to an event taking place or something that was going on. Now, let me reiterate. Rare. We've seen lots of cases where people had an acute drop in HDL and nothing seemed to be a reason for it. It's just that these 2 were a bit unusual. We usually recommend getting wider spectrum tests
to CA 125 or other. Okay.
To rule out the usual suspects and so forth. But it's why we get interested.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, what a great way to. I mean, it makes sense again, and it fits in with your model because if the cancer cell is growing, it's going to need cell membranes and lipids and things and energy, and so potentially that's where. And in this, there's putting energy out, but it's not coming back in the.
Well,
what would your?
I have some speculations, but they're very rough to the point where I almost don't even want to speculate. Okay. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
I'll say this from a larger point of view. I actually really like cholesterol tests more now as potentially a diagnostic tool. Your lipids can say a lot about what's going on. So, for example, you could be a lean mass hyperresponder that has high trigs, not because you're being a lean mass hyperresponder or you have a sensitivity to coffee, but because you're actually sick right now. And that can show up in things like, say, LP(a) or ferritin or other things. And we might have a reason to look for that, which is why a lot of times that'll be a question that we'll ask as well. Is if we're running out of other reasons you could have high trigs, we could be saying, have you had any kind of illness recently? Oh, yeah, actually, I was just recovering from the flu, something.
Right.
Okay.
Good to know.
Lead with that next time, right? Because that can impact your lipids, right?
Totally. That's such a great point. I have been doing blood work and stuff since 2008, and just a few years into it, was like 2009 range, my ferritin came back at over 500. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have hemochromatosis. I was like, yeah, I knew the guy at LabCorp. I was like, you got to get me the gene test and everything like that. And I didn't remember being sick when I got my blood work done.
Yeah.
And first of all, he's like, look, don't freak out. Just redo the test. It's like sometimes there's test errors that, we don't want to talk about that, but it happens. So I was like, no. I need to do a gene test too. He's like, okay, fine. I'll just give you a comp. It was like $300, whatever. So I was negative for the gene and retest it. My ferritin, I think, was like 130 in that range, right? So it had significantly dropped to the normal level. So consider that, friends, if you're listening and you have an abnormal level, just redo it and don't get too freaked out.
Well, and be aware of that context. It's been serendipitous that Siobhan, that's been a lot of her research, is she's focused on the immune response. And she has her own numbers to show. She went and got blood tests every time she was sick. Sure enough, she saw an acute rise in ferritin. She saw a rise in her Lp(a). And she's got great write-ups on this. Sickness can impact many different markers, including potentially lipid markers, including, by the way, small, dense LDL.
It increases?
It can increase, yeah.
So it's like the surface area, right? If there's free radicals or bad guys, you'd want a lot of troops on the ground, potentially.
It is. And to what degree that's actually de novo lipidated, to where it's actually coming out and where they're not actually VLDLs and which they're actually secreted as LDLs, can't say for sure. But we can say that actually there is that association with small dense, not necessarily just because they're hanging around, but also because they can get their phospholipid shell oxidized, and that can also potentially be cleaved down to make smaller and smaller versions. Again, all of these things, if there's any big theme takeaway I want to say, is all of these things is why I don't look at lipoproteins from a lipoprotein-centric model of atherogenicity. I look at them as a good reflection of the atherogenicity of your system, right?
That's a good point.
So if you have a broken system, that could be reflected in the lipoproteins. And then you then blame them, kind of like you could blame the ambulance outside your neighbor's house as being the one that caused the trouble, because every time you see ambulances in the neighborhood,
something bad happens, right?
Yeah, something bad happens, right?
Yeah, that's such an interesting way to think about that. And we do like to look at things, right? And we focus on it's glucose. Glucose is a problem, right? But it could be insulin or other GI issues or microbiome. And there's other ways to think about this through the systems mindset. And I love, you and Ivor, and you come at this through the engineering mindset. So you don't have this preconceived notion like a lot of medical doctors and traditionally trained and even integrative trained practitioners have, that LDL is atherogenic. You need it to be lower.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen, I've sold supplements for the past 12 years in a supplement rep, and I've seen so many integrative naturopathic doctors prescribe red yeast rice, which is a natural version of a statin, when LDL is high. It's like, oh, you need more niacin, we need to bring that down, instead of looking at why. Were you sick? Do you have immune responses, whatever, cancer?
Or you're just powered more by fat.
Exactly. Dave Feldman, really, really appreciate you coming on. We do have some questions, and let's just quickly scroll through. And guys, I really, really apologize for the feed dropping. Oh my gosh, look at this, Dave. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all this stuff. But I'm super grateful that you are all here. Let's see here. Do you recognize any friends here? David is a genius. Yes, he is.
Siobhan Huggins actually jumped in. I don't actually think I have write-ups for my sick data yet. I'm horrible.
Oh, come on. Don't be so hard on yourself.
That's right. She'll have the motivation now.
Yeah. Well, let's... we're going to have... Dave and I are going to have dinner. We'll look through these and then address some of the questions that you guys have. And if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like button. Share this with someone that needs to hear this in your family, that is worried about their cholesterol, particularly if they're on a low-carb, high-fat diet or exercising. And then, Dave, as a final kind of call to action for everyone listening in iTunes or watching this right now, if people want to support your work, which I think they should do, I know you're active on Patreon.
Yeah. You can go to patreon.com/Dave Feldman.
Okay.
I should emphasize, is probably the worst Patreon pitch ever. I do mean for all of the important data and all of the research to be made free forever. So patrons who come, and to further the awfulness of this pitch, if the money's consequential to you, don't pay for the patron. But if you do support the work with those two major caveats, then please, I definitely appreciate it. This work wouldn't actually be possible were it not for all of these amazing individuals.
Which is so cool.
And it really is. I mean, I am truly now a citizen scientist who is crowdfunded.
It's so awesome.
It's crazy.
I commend you for that.
Yeah.
That's awesome, Dave. Well, and I'm very grateful for all of you being here right now. If you were to bump shoulders, we always ask this on the end of every show. If you were to bump shoulders with a politician, and they said, Dave, you've been doing all this research and stuff. You have over thousands of people that have been sending you their labs. What do we need to know about cholesterol? Like if you could just break it down, like how could, on a policy level, how could things be reframed potentially?
I would just change the way science is done. It's not just cholesterol. I feel like cholesterol being vilified was only possible in a system where there was not as much transparency as I would like.
Yeah.
So I feel like while we don't have enough time to get into it, I feel like there could be a better version of peer review. Mm-hmm. I wish that there was more capability for publicly archived data.
Right.
I feel like, and I get a little bit passionate about this one, but I feel like a lot of the data that's sitting right now in databases could have so much powerful machine learning applied to it that my field could really be saving lives with if we just had more capability for access.
Horizontal integration.
Yeah, it would, and we already do that all the time on our side of the fence in technology, all the time. The reason the targeted ads are so amazing,
right? Is when you go to Amazon, go back to Facebook. The reason that's there is because of engineers like yourself.
Yeah, and you say you hate it, you say you hate the privacy, but you know what? It actually makes things faster along. Yeah. Think what we could do with health.
Amazing.
I mean, truly.
Yeah. Appreciate it, buddy. Really appreciate your work, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, buddy. It was awesome. We're going to eat, guys. We're going to get your questions, and hope you have a great Sunday night, or if you're watching this later on in the week, hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching all the way through. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so, because you'll be notified then in real time when we're doing live streams like this. We're uploading snippets, which we'll do of this video and others. So very much appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm very grateful. We'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
And sorry for that live stream drop. Gosh.
No worries.
Yeah.